Well, 2 weeks ago, we left the prophet Jeremiah weeping as the Babylonians destroyed the temple and carted off the best and the brightest of Judah. During the Babylonian exile, the people had to remember who they were if they were to remain a people. They didn't have political independence, but they could maintain their moral independence, even if that meant facing the fire of a furnace. Last week, we heard how King Darius was awed by the power of Daniel's God to save that young man from the jaws of lions. The king was so impressed that he sent word throughout his empire, all peoples and all nations in every language, about this God of Daniel, the living God whose dominion had no end. All of this worked together to bring about God's intention, that upper story that we've been talking about for these many weeks. God's intention for the children of Abraham to become a nation through which all the families of earth would be blessed. Well, God allowed these same children of Abraham to live out the natural consequences of their actions. For their faithlessness, God permitted the Babylonians to take them captive, to haul them away. And there in exile, the people had years in which to think about what they had done, who they had become. But after that period of correction, God called them home. King Cyrus, Gentile king, outside the faith, King Cyrus heard God speak to him very clearly that the Jews should go back to their homeland, should go back to Judah, should rebuild the temple. And Cyrus permitted it. Now, what God was asking for the Jews to do, and all that God was asking for the Jews to do, was to return home, worship, and build the temple. God promised to take care of all the rest. God would provide the supplies that were needed to build this temple. God would provide the protection they needed to complete the task. And God would make sure that the temple furnishings that had been taken by the Babylonians when they destroyed the first temple would be returned. The people only had to worship and rebuild. That's all it would take to really be at home again. Now we understand how the Jews felt in Babylon. If you've ever read Psalm 137, you hear their mourning, their lament. We sit by the rivers in Babylon and wept. How could we sing songs of Zion in a foreign land? It's a heartbreaking psalm at the beginning. It's actually very troubling when you get to the end of it, but you might want to look that up later. But we understand that they really felt separated from all that they were by living in this foreign land. They understood that they were not at home. Even though their captors had housed them, they were not at home. Because home is where the heart is. And in exile, the people remembered that their hearts belonged to God. The symbol of this belonging to God was the temple in Jerusalem. This was the place where worship occurred. This was the place where sacrifice brought God and humans together in right relationship. This is the place that represented God's intention to live among the people. The temple was the house of God. The temple was a sign and a symbol of their deep connection to God. In this land of promise, in the place of worship, with God's presence among them, the people could be at home. Away from that, they could not be. But after the Persians then conquered the Babylonians, King Cyrus decreed that the Jews were to go home. They were to go home and rebuild the temple. But it wasn't easy when they got back. Now, things started out with great promise. They did what they were supposed to do initially. But they met opposition. The people who had taken up residence there while they were gone didn't think too much of them coming back. Kind of sounds like modern history, doesn't it? and that delayed the building of the temple. King Darius, who came after Cyrus, reaffirmed the first king's intention, the first king's decree. And the building continued. And now doesn't this sound like a wonderful story? Everything fell into place. And God's upper story intention of working in the human lower story to make all people aware of who God was, who God is, and who God will be was finally going to happen. God invited the people back home. God brought the people back home. They were beginning the building program. What could possibly go wrong? What problems could emerge after all they had been through, after all they had learned? What could possibly become a problem for them? The problem was that human beings were still human beings. That had not changed during the time of exile. And throughout our journey through the scriptures, we've seen that remarkable ability of human beings to forget. Humans have this inclination to want what they want when they want it and to push God aside, to forget about God in the pursuit of it. Now, they may have every good intention of getting back to God later, but then life seemed to get in the way and it just didn't happen. God's people started out with such promise. Using the supplies that God gave, they began to rebuild God's temple. And they knew that when the temple was complete, they would be once again able to fully worship, have those times of sacrifice, and really connect again with God. They would know that they were at home when all of this took place. That temple would be that constant, visible, physical reminder that God was with them, that God's presence was among them. They would be at home. They would finally be comfortable once again in who they were and how they lived. All they had to do was turn their hearts toward God, and it would work. They would be home again. But the people decided to leave home. Now, they never left Judah. They simply didn't do as God had instructed. Now, even before the craftsmen laid the foundation of this new temple, the priests set up an altar. They offered burnt sacrifices. They kept the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, booths, however you want to call it. They paid the masons, they paid the carpenters, they imported cedar from other countries. They were ready to do the work. And as the masons laid that foundation, the priests praised the Lord with trumpets and cymbals and singing songs of praise and thanksgiving. The people responded. They were right there with them. Now, many of the people cheered. This was a momentous moment in their history. This was a sign that they were reestablishing themselves as God's people in the promised land. But there were some who wept at this momentous occasion. You see, they remembered the last temple, and this one was nothing compared to the splendor of what Solomon had built. And then the troubles began. Their neighbors began to offer them opposition. They met with fierce resistance. And somehow their enthusiasm for God, what they experienced in that moment, began to fade away. They weren't up to the challenge of confronting those around them to do what God wanted. So they turned their hearts inward and chose to satisfy their own desires rather than listen to God's instructions. They built beautiful houses of comfort for themselves rather than obey God's command to rebuild the temple and worship. But despite the human penchant for forgetting, we know that God is ever faithful, for great is God's faithfulness. The people may turn away from their God, but God never turns away from those created in the divine image. Rather than turn to another people, to another nation, to work through, to bring about the fulfillment of God's intention, to bless all the families of the earth, to show all the families who God is. God remained faithful to the promises made to the ancestors. God decided to continue to show the nature and character of God through the children of Abraham. And God intended to invite all people to know God and to be known by God through these same people. But God had a problem. It was the humans. The humans had decided that what they wanted was more important than what God wanted. The humans who decided that the fight was too great, they weren't going to trouble themselves to do what God desired. So God had to do what God had done in the past, which was raise up prophets. We heard too, as Lee read the scriptures to us this day. You see, God raised up the prophets so that God could continue to invite the people to participate in God's great plan, that they would turn their hearts towards God, come home again, and once again be able to bless the nations of the earth. Well, on the day of sacrifice, the first day of the month, God spoke through Haggai and asked the people, do you know why your life is so hard? I have the impression, the feeling from reading the prophet, that they had no idea why their crops were faring poorly, why there was never quite enough to eat, why their clothes weren't sufficient to the weather that they were experiencing, and why their income seemed to go out as fast as it came in. They seemed to be baffled by this, but God said, do you know why? Let me tell you why. You've built your own houses of comfort, and you forgot about my house. You allow my house to lie in ruins while you do nothing more than feather your nests. God could not bless a disobedient people. God could not make the crops abundant. God could not make the weather mild. God could not give them incomes. Why, they lived in such disobedience. What kind of witness would that be to the nations? What would that tell the nations about God? That it's okay to live any way you want? That it's okay to focus completely on yourself and to forget about God? That it's okay not to love one another? God couldn't do that because that is not God's nature and God's character. But God ended this indictment against the people with words of hope, a reminder, a promise. I am with you. Now, unlike Jeremiah, to whom no one paid attention, the people got it. They listened to Haggai. And even though this temple was not impressive compared to the previous one, they pursued rebuilding it. They were doing it for the right reasons now. They were doing it for God. On their own, the people were not capable of building a temple worthy of God, but God was. God promised to work through the nations to make God's house a place of splendor. On their own, the people could not make themselves pure and clean and holy, but God could. In the cleansed and rededicated temple, God would give them a new beginning. The people heard God's invitation to come home, to really come home, not just land in the land of Judah, but to come home to where they really belong. And they did. With all their heart, they obeyed God. And as they turned their hearts toward God and became a blessing to the families of the earth, they saw the truth.